So today I'm here with my friend Jaime. Some of you may know him from Respiratory Therapy Resource Center. He's very active on YouTube as well as Instagram. I highly suggest that you go check out some of his stuff. He's very helpful for respiratory therapists as well as respiratory therapy students. Today we're also going to talk about ECMO and what it's like working on an ECMO team, as well as how one can become an ECMO specialist as a respiratory therapist. But first, you want to introduce yourself?
Hey guys, you might know me from Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. I'm Jaime. I'm the creator of the Respiratory Therapy Resource Center, and I had the privilege of being accepted into the ECMO team at my previous hospital. And even though I loved it, I've decided to take the leap and join Travel RT. And I'm going to, see what else is out there. But today we're going to focus on talking about ECMO, what it is, how it works, and different opportunities for respiratory therapists in that field of ECMO. So I worked at Texas Children's Hospital, and they actually recently opened up an adult congenital heart disease unit. And it's an ICU unit for patients who have congenital heart disease into their adulthood, because we've done such a good job of fixing them as children that they are now living longer into adulthood. So there's definitely a need for that patient population. So we do ECMO on adults and kids at Texas Children's Hospital, and we're even able to do it on OB-GYN patients who are actively pregnant or just delivered their babies who require ECMO support. So ECMO is extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. So that is basically you have this machine that is performing bypass on the lungs or the lungs and heart in order to sustain your perfusion and oxygenation through the machine, as opposed to your actual lungs and heart, right? So we're giving your heart and lungs a rest and letting the machine take on all of that metabolic energy, right? So your metabolic requirement goes down because now the machine is doing all the work for you. They use a similar machine, not exactly the same machine, but a similar machine for cardiac bypass in the OR, right? So that's run by the cardiopulmonary perfusionist. And we as ECMO specialists get trained on the bedside machine. So at our hospital, we use the HL20. That was the name of the system we used to perform ECMO and manage that pump at the bedside. So now that we've put the patient on ECMO, they're able to rest and actually heal, right, from their heart and lungs, whatever issues they may have. So there's two types of ECMO. There's VV ECMO, venous, which means that you're going to put a cannula in a huge vein, right? A lot of times the IJ and maybe the femoral vein, right? So you're going to put it in two different places. Now we have cannulas that actually can be a 2-in-1, right? So it's called the Avalon Cannula. So you can put one cannula just in the IJ, and it's going to have 3 ports, 2 to suck blood out from the SVC and the IVC, and then 1 in the RA that's going to inject the blood back into the heart in the RA, right? So you have that option for cannula, but they both work the same in terms of VV, right? So you're taking from the venous and you're dumping back into the venous, right? And VV is going to support the lungs specifically, okay? So your heart still has native function, still has pulsatility, and still controls your blood pressure and hemodynamics in VV ECMO. In VA ECMO, the ECMO machine is actually going to take over for both the heart and the lungs. So now the ECMO machine is taking over the hemodynamics of the patient. The pulsatility of the heart is no longer a big factor, right? And so for, a short side note, we don't like to do VA on pregnant women because you do take away that pulsatility of the heart, and it's now going to be more determined by the ECMO machine. So we don't want to take that chance with the baby if they're still actively pregnant. So VV would be a better option for pregnant women. If it's not possible, then yeah, VA. But we always start with VV for pregnant women so that the pulsatility of the heart won't skip a beat for the baby to get blood. So we can ensure the baby is still getting proper blood flow because the mom's heart is maintaining the pulsatility and the blood pressure and the hemodynamics for the baby. So that's a little bit about VV and VA, you know. Sometimes you need VA. VA would be like a step up from VV, right? And it's been a very, you know, interesting experience, clinically enriching experience. And you also kind of have a lot of adrenaline pumping the entire shift because you're hoping and praying that nothing goes wrong with the circuit, because if it does, you're the one who has to troubleshoot, alarm everyone, and fix it before the primer team can come and help you fix the machine faster, right? So that's kind of a synopsis and a overview of what ECMO is and how it can be used.
So what are some different reasons that you put someone on ECMO, and why put someone on VV versus VA? I mean, we kind of talked about that a little bit, but what are some different scenarios that you personally gone through?
So like COVID patients, right? So COVID patients are a prime example right now. A lot of them, especially adults, we put them on VV. We put them on VV because typically their heart is fine. The function of their heart, first of all, they have normal anatomy, right? They're usually previously healthy. They don't have any kind of congenital defects. So it's usually just their lungs. They have that bilateral ARDS pneumonia, right? They have that typical presentation going on. So really their heart is fine, right? Most of the time, their heart is fine. So they don't really require that cardiac support from VA. So we'll slap them on VV. So someone with ARDS, someone with bad pneumonia, someone with, you know, like interstitial lung disease. I mean, we might not really do that very much, but we definitely have seen it with any type of pneumonia, any type of flu, you know, lung infections, all of those things where the heart is pretty much, you know, still functioning and good to go. Now, cardiac, when you would use VA, would be more like your cardiogenic shocks, your hypoplastic lungs, more of like the pediatric population. I mean, you can use it in either population, peds or adults. It just depends. We've had some patients who get that like myocarditis or like either from the flu or from COVID-19. It's less common, but it does happen. And they need support for both the heart and the lungs, right? So you have that. And then, yeah, just different types of shock.
You see like a lot of like, if they have a heart condition when they're born, do they get put on ECMO right away, or do they kind of fix that with surgery first? Have you seen that?
Right. So ECMO doesn't necessarily, if you're born with a congenital heart condition, it's not like a straight shot to ECMO. It depends on the severity. It depends on if you, we're going to look at your OI as a kid. Your OI matters more in the PICU than it does in CV. So your OI is your oxygenation index, and they're going to look at that value more than like for PICU type patients who have normal anatomy. For CV kids, they're going to look more at your like hemodynamic stability, what inotropes you're on, and if you're responding to that treatment to kind of help, you know, facilitate with medications first. They're going to try to facilitate your pulsatility, your heart beating to kind of support the heart to pump blood through the whole body, right? So if those medications are no longer enough, and you have more hemodynamic instability and you're starting to desaturate because you can't keep up with the metabolic demand of the patient, then they're starting to look at, okay, let's call the ECMO team. At our hospital, they'll usually call the ECMO team and let them know we have a kid who's kind of riding the fence hemodynamically with their saturations particularly in CV, right? Like be on call, have a pump ready to go, and then we'll see how he does, right? So we'll try titrate his drips. We'll see what else we can do for his hemodynamics. But if he continues to go down that path, then okay, we're going to call you and we're just going to put him right on ECMO, cannulate, and put him on ECMO. So it depends, they're going to watch for all those things, the hemodynamic stability. And like, as far as adults, usually the way it will go, let's say you have a COVID patient, you're maxed out on vent settings, you're on high PEEPs, you're on 100% oxygen, you're probably on nitric, you're giving nebulizer treatments, you're doing other like therapies to try and help clear the lungs. But with COVID-19, it's very hard to open up those alveoli and recruit the lung because of the way COVID-19 works. So you might even try APRV and then that's still not working, right? So you're kind of maxed out on the vent and then you're like, well, the next option is ECMO, right? So that's kind of how you would gauge it that way. In adult patients, you can use their PF ratio, but it's not rocket science to know that a patient on a PEEP of 15, 16, 17, 18, and 100% is pretty maxed out on the vent. Like you're gonna know that, right? So you can calculate the PF ratio, that's fine, because clinically that's what you're supposed to do. But I mean, you can also see, okay, their x-ray is not getting better, their gases aren't getting better, their ABGs, right? We're gonna use that data. Okay, they're still desatting with all of these interventions, all these inotropes, all this vent support. ECMO is going to be the next logical step. So, I mean, all those other things are important because you want to practice with evidence-based, but you're already collecting your data about the patient, looking at the monitor, looking at the end tidal, collecting your ABGs, looking at the x-rays. Things aren't getting better, right? So you're like, okay, consult the ECMO team, right? And then they'll come and, go through everything and see if the patient requires ECMO. That's the way I always look at it, so.
Has your hospital always had an ECMO team, and how did you become a part of it?
Yeah, so our hospital's had an ECMO team for quite some time. The older people on the team would tell us how it used to be, the type of machine that they used to use, the issues that they had with like bleeding and coagulation. And now ECMO therapy is very targeted and under watch very closely with labs. They would always monitor those things, but the machinery that they used it didn't have the technology that we have available today. So a lot of the issues that they had to deal with as far as the actual machine breaking or the machine clotting off, we still have those issues, but they're far less frequent. And so even though, our hospital was one of, the first hospitals to incorporate ECMO into their practice. So when I heard about the ECMO team and the fact that they allow respiratory therapists and nurses to join the team, I immediately set that as a goal when I started working at Texas Children's, right? I was like, I want to be part of the ECMO team. I want to learn more about the human body, anatomy, and physiology. And I want to, be more incorporated into the team in that sense. And so I applied. We have a application that comes around every year. And so any RT and any nurse who's interested in joining the ECMO team just applies for the team. And then, the head honcho, right? So our head honcho and his other like close circle of primers, get feedback, and they get feedback from the nursing staff, the physician staff, and other ECMO specialists about each applicant and see who's going to be a good fit for the team, like who's going to be a team player, who is really competent and steps above the rest, right? Who has good relationships with the physician team, with the nursing staff, because you want someone who is going to be easy to work with, who's going to pick up OT, who's going to be very competent and know what to do, and confident, but not overconfident, So that's kind of what they're looking for. Also, how much experience you have as well. How many years have you worked here in the CVICU? And they really, at my hospital, they really liked therapists or nurses who worked in CVICU, because that was a big part of the ECMO population at our hospital, was the CVICU, right? Because those were a lot of our pediatric kids who were on ECMO, or they were on bypass during surgery and they just failed to wean off bypass. So they just switched them and put them on an ECMO circuit and brought them out on ECMO. And sometimes they just need a little bit of time to kind of recuperate during that time period. So they might not be able to come off bypass. And it's really interesting because like that's one of the things that drew me to ECMO, because every patient's different. They're on it for a different reason. You know, you might have some patients who are awaiting a lung transplant, right? So they're waiting, and we're kind of using it now as like a bridge to transplant, whether it's a lung transplant or a heart transplant, and we're just buying time in that way, right? So but yeah, so that was kind of what I did, right? I got a few years of experience. I applied for the job. I interviewed with the manager and I got the job. Now, one thing I do want to point out about ECMO is that it's, in my opinion, it's very institutionally dependent, right? It depends on where you work, the institution you work for, and they may allow respiratory therapists to be on the team. They may not accept applications from the respiratory department. It might be run by the respiratory department. Ours is run under the respiratory department as one of the pieces of the respiratory department, right? Other facilities, it might run as its own department, right? It might run under the nursing department. So it just depends. It just depends on the institution. Usually each institution is going to have a training course for you to go through. Like our training course at Texas Children's was an 8-week period of training. And we went every Tuesday. We went for training. We had lecture in the morning. We learned about ECMO, and then we had wet lab in the afternoon. And then we actually got to like put our hands on the circuit and do a bunch of things that we're gonna be doing in real life. But fortunately, there was no patient attached to the circuit, right? So that was a golden opportunity for us to really get our hands wet and our feet dirty. So but that's kind of how it was for us. Other hospitals are going to do it differently. So I can speak to Texas Children's, but there's just no set education requirements. There's no school that you can go to that I know of that is for ECMO. And even if, let's say there's some school that is like, oh, get your ECMO certificate or degree even, that would be nice. Maybe one day it will get there, but ultimately right now, the way it is, the hospital will train you in the way that they do ECMO, because they might use a different machine as well, right? Just like vents, every hospital uses different vents, right? So you're going to have to learn that vent, but the concepts are the same. In ventilators, the concepts are the same. In ECMO, the concepts are the same. It's just a different machine that you have to get used to the interface and how it works, but the concepts are the same.
I do find that you were very, very fortunate to do that. I actually know a girl, she had to go to Thomas Jefferson in Philly. She took a class, I forget how often, but hers was like an 8-week program as well. And then she actually had to go in and like shadow the perfusionists, shadow other ECMO teams, go to different hospitals, and she was all over the place rather than one facility like you. That's pretty cool. I think that program is definitely pretty good. So did they want you to get your ECMO specialist then, or was that something you were going to do on your own?
So they, like when we graduated off of orientation, we were ECMO specialists. So I didn't go to like an outside school, like they trained me there. So I was referred to as an ECMO specialist at my hospital. Now, if I went to another hospital, that's probably not going to be recognized. And if I wanted to be on their team, I would probably have to apply and go through all the same steps the same way. But I'm not familiar with people like going to like an ECMO program outside of a hospital. Usually they get trained through a hospital from what I know. So
yeah, it was kind of weird how hers happened, but I mean, she's doing it now. She travels to different hospitals in Philly and kind of Like it's
So
almost like a PRN thing for her.
right. So I was going to mention that sometimes there's not a lot of ECMO happening at one hospital. One hospital, like our hospital, they decided to create an ECMO team with nurses and respiratory therapists because before they had that, they had perfusionists coming in, right? So they were like contracted, like what you're talking about, right? How she's going to different hospitals. So they had a contracting company that would come in and they would pay these perfusionists like loads of money, right? Just money out, paying for the perfusionists. And so, and they were contracted, right? They would come in, sit, pump, and get paid, right? And that's what we all want, right? So, but so for the hospital, they said we're doing ECMO so often, so frequently. It just became more of a thing, right? It was more, of a treatment. We're doing it. We're not just doing it, we're getting really good at doing it, right? And it's one thing if you're not doing it that often, yeah, it makes more sense to contract someone to come in. Hey, we have one ECMO patient, maybe for your friend, hey, can you come sit pump, right? And she's maybe covering 3 or 4 hospitals that do it once in a while. Our facility, there's almost always an ECMO pump running, at least 1 or 2. And so, like right now, I think there's 6 pumps running. So you need people to staff those pumps, right? And so that's what made the most sense for our hospital, right? Because we've also built a new building and we have more patients now than we've ever had. And they're still going to expand and build another building. And so they're like, we're constantly doing ECMO. Like, we need an in-house team. We can't keep contracting for a team that we really should just have a team here, like staffed through the hospital. So that's what made them just create their own team, because they're paying like $120 an hour to perfusionists who were contracted. And but then like I said, it became so common, and they're like, we're paying them so much money, we can kind of cut down on costs also by hiring the nursing staff and the respiratory staff into an ECMO position and train them.
So once you got through orientation and everything, did you see any kind of small pay increase? You don't have to say exactly what it was, but
So the way it works at our hospital is there's 2 teams. There's the flex team and the core team, right? So the flex team, you get overtime pay like you would get any overtime shift, right? So whether I worked an overtime shift as an RT or an ECMO specialist, I would get overtime pay. So that was my pay. And if you were core team, then you would get a pay increase, right? So that the core team was when you specifically got hired onto the ECMO team as like a more of a permanent staff member. And so, yes, that definitely comes with more of a pay bump. So
yes,
yeah.
a lot more responsibility.
Yeah. And then more of the, like you said, more of the responsibility falls on the core team and the primer team. And I was looking to go core, I definitely was. It's definitely a goal most people have when they join the ECMO team. But for me, I just decided it was time to start traveling a little more. I've lived in Houston almost 4 years, and it's been a good run, and when your run is over, you kind of feel it, your run is over, and it'll be nice to kind of get back to my family and see how everybody's doing. And I feel like every time I go home, there's another baby, and I'm like, oh my God, like everyone's, getting married and having kids, and it'll be nice to kind of reconnect with that. So yeah, so that's kind of been my ECMO experience, and it was great. It was great while it lasted, and I really appreciate that opportunity that they gave me. And we'll see. I mean, I'm going to be traveling now, and there's going to be other ECMO centers. And for anyone who's really interested, like there's a website, it's called ELSO. And I'll give it to Austin to put in maybe like the description. It's elso.org, and it's the international nonprofit organization for ECMO. So if you're watching this video and you're interested in ECMO, you can go to that website, and they will have posted the ECMO centers in the whole world, right? And so you'll have them listed like platinum, silver, gold. I think that's the order of it. or platinum, gold, and silver. And so you can see, like, is there an ECMO center near you? Because you'd have to work at an ECMO center, a hospital that does ECMO, right? And there's not every hospital does ECMO. That's the other thing. And unfortunately, in my hometown, that's one thing we learned during the pandemic. There were a lot of people who could have benefited from ECMO, especially adult COVID patients, but there was no ECMO offered, right? Because there was no team, there was no one to sit pump and watch the pump. They just never really had a need for it. And if they did, once in a blue moon before COVID, they would ship them out. They would ship them to San Antonio, Dallas, Houston. And but because of COVID, they found a lot more need for ECMO, but they didn't have ECMO available. And so a lot of people died in my hometown, in particular, El Paso, Texas. So, but you know, maybe some of them could have lived if they had the opportunity to, you know, have ECMO being used at that facility. So not every hospital has ECMO, and it's important to remember that. So if you have a relative who's like really going down the tubes or whatever, and always ask, does your hospital offer ECMO? If not, can we transfer him out to another hospital that does? Because that's definitely a relevant question if you're in that position.
So off the top of your head, what are some contraindications for ECMO? Like, why wouldn't a person be able to go on ECMO?
So contraindications for ECMO, I would say, you know, you kind of have to think about where you're going with the patient, right? So for example, I mean, sometimes you'll put a patient on ECMO and then you find that you kind of hit a roadblock of, we don't really know what else we can do. They might have an unresolving infection without a source, right? But they're already on ECMO. And so you're like, they're not responding to treatment. They're not responding to any antibiotics. So then you kind of have to decide what to do after the fact. Or patients with like, who are not transplant candidates, they'll usually say, well, they're not a candidate because of XYZ. Even before COVID, I want to make that clear. Before COVID, there was always a candidacy list, a criteria list for people to qualify for transplants, right? And so if they're not qualifying for a transplant and you're deciding whether or not to put them on ECMO, you know, if they don't qualify for a transplant, then you wouldn't put them on ECMO, right? That most hospitals probably wouldn't put them on ECMO. So it just depends, you know, you have to look at the patient as a whole. Like, is there a way that we can fix what is wrong with the patient? If there is no solution, if there is no way to fix the patient, then you shouldn't put them on ECMO, right? You can't put someone on ECMO just because, especially in peds, just because mom and dad ask you to, right? There has to be a solution, a resolution. If you cannot fix it, then they shouldn't be put on ECMO, right? It doesn't mean they won't be though. Like some hospitals, they're like, we're going to do it anyways, right? It depends on the team. It depends on the physician staff and what they're willing to do, right? So, so first and foremost that, right? I mean, other than that, I feel like we've gotten really good at doing ECMO. And, you know, there's that list of unresolving, you know, ailments has gotten a lot smaller now with ECMO. So it just depends, you know.
So if anyone else has any questions about ECMO, or if you have any questions for Jaime here, you can leave them in the comments, or you can find him on YouTube at Respiratory Therapy Resource Center, as well as Instagram, Respiratory Therapy Resource Center. Go ahead and shoot him a message, give him a follow. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a little bit, and he will also post this video on his page as well. So if you have any direct questions for him, then you don't want to go through me. Like I said, Instagram, or just shoot over to that video and leave a message or comment. All right, well, thank you, and we'll see you in the next one.